Ukraine, the State of the Union, and Ketanji Brown Jackson. I'm Eric Miller, and this is The Square Circle. Hello, and welcome to The Square Circle. I'm your host, Eric Miller. Joining us today, our libertarian author and podcast host, Remso Martinez. Welcome, Remso.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Conservative and Newsweek contributing editor, Peter Roff. Good to see you again, Peter.
Good evening. Good to be here.
And progressive political reporter, James Rosen. Welcome back to the show, James.
Thanks, Eric. Good to see you.
The war of Russian aggression into Ukraine has entered its second week. While the Ukrainian people have put up stiff resistance, many observers predict that it's only a matter of time before Russian forces overwhelm the country. Let's begin with James. What do you believe is Putin's endgame at this point in the war?
Well, I've been wrong about Putin just pretty recently, so whatever I say with some hesitation. I covered Putin a bit early in his career, very early in his career in Moscow. And since then, I thought he was very shrewd, a very stable genius. But to quote one of his friends, but I don't understand the invasion of Ukraine at all. And I told friends, and I said on another show recently that he would never try to take Kiev. I thought he would limit himself to the dominant Russian enclaves in Ukraine. So I was wrong. So, in terms of his end game now, I think it's been a catastrophic miscalculation on his part. I don't think he anticipated the European unity. I don't think he anticipated the NATO unity. I don't think he anticipated the almost worldwide criticism that he's gotten. So I think it's been a miscalculation given where he is now. If I had to predict, I think his end game is to negotiate some sort of face-saving settlement and declare victory. But I do think he will add territory to what he had before the invasion, the Donbass area, some of the other enclaves. And I don't know how that will fit into the settlement. I arrived in Moscow as a correspondent in 1989 as the Soviet troops were withdrawing from Afghanistan with their tails behind their legs after a 10-year occupation. And just as we in Iraq forgot the lessons of Vietnam, apparently President Putin has forgotten the lessons of Afghanistan.
Peter, over to you. Do you agree with James, or do you have a different take on where Putin is headed now?
I think Putin's endgame is and always has been the reconstitution of Greater Russia. He doesn't see himself as Stalin. He sees himself as Peter the Great, the Tsar who brought Russia to the West. What he wasn't counting on, and what's largely been the way things have progressed in the Putin era is the West, the NATO countries, have been saying to themselves, be quiet. The Russian bear is sleeping. You don't want to poke him. You don't want to wake him up. Putin took that for weakness. I think he took it correctly for weakness. What he didn't understand is the severity and commitment that he made, not just to take the Russian sectors of Ukraine, but to take the whole country, had the effect of uniting the West, the Germans, the French, the Brits, the Dutch, the Belgians, the Poles, the Romanians, the Americans. We're all on the same side now. And not because of anything President Biden or Chancellor Scholz or Prime Minister Johnson did, but because of what Putin did. And they see that the Russian bear is now awake, he's hungry, and he wants to start roaming around and reestablishing his territory. The way I see this, it ends in one of two ways. Putin, either because he's been victorious or distract from the way he's been bogged down in Ukraine, makes moves against the Baltic states, which triggers a response from NATO. And we find ourselves in another land war in Europe. And if we're fortunate, it will remain a land war in Europe and not become a global conflict. Or Russia gets out of Ukraine because Putin's out of Russia. The sanctions against the oligarchs are real, they're personal, and may provide an incentive for them to depose Putin and send him off permanently in retirement to his dacha, or a convenient plane crash or car accident. Oh my, how horrible. We're heartbroken. What a surprise. But I don't see this ending, as James suggested, with some kind of a face-saving solution, because Putin clearly isn't interested in saving face. He's interested in reconstituting Greater Russia.
So Remso, where do you fall on this? Do you align with James that we're looking at a face-saving maneuver, or are you more in the Peter camp that this is a reconstitution of the Greater Russia?
I tend to agree with Peter on this one, because Putin has made it quite known that that was always his ambition. He cried when the Soviet Union broke apart. He cried when Mother Russia was no longer in charge of all of its children, including its breadbasket. But, I thought this whole thing would be over when the International Judo Federation said that Putin was no longer their honorary president and chairman, and that hasn't seemed to have done anything. I tend to agree with Peter in the fact that this is going to end up, with Putin either retiring in exile or being overthrown or something. But at the end of the day, this whole thing is going to end on his terms, whether they're good for him or not. He's the only one that can ultimately decide to end this.
Well, let's stay with Remso for just a second. Given that view of what lies ahead, what do you believe the United States' next steps should be?
I think we've done enough. In fact, I think we've actually contributed to more of the damage than most people are willing to consider. I mean, you go ahead and imagine, what if China was putting missiles in Mexico aimed north? This wouldn't have happened if we hadn't been trying to pressure Ukraine into joining NATO. If Ukraine wasn't pestering Russia with the idea that they might join NATO. Any country that's antagonistic as Russia is going to go ahead and do something like this. And the fact that so many people were surprised by the fact that, hey, Russia actually did what we thought they were capable of doing, that's the sad part. I mean, NATO should have ended decades ago, after the fall of the Soviet Union. The fact that it's been able to stay up for as long as it has, I mean, I'm not defending Putin. I feel terrible that I have to preface with that. But, when you antagonate somebody enough, why should anyone be surprised when they retaliate like that? That's what's led to the situation we're in now.
James, what do you think? Do you agree that we have enough in place, or does the U.S. need to do more?
I think that remains to be seen. I mean, I'd like to respond to a couple things that Remso just said. President Trump questioned the usefulness of NATO, as Remso said, given what we thought was the end of the Cold War, and he was ridiculed for it. But earlier, closer to the end of the Cold War, a lot of people questioned the usefulness of NATO. And I think one of the unfortunate, I disagree a little bit with Remso that the United States has pressured Ukraine to join NATO. I think it's the opposite. Ukraine has wanted to join NATO for a long time. And with the United States in the lead, because we knew what that would do, the impact on Russia, we resisted that. We didn't allow that to happen as we did with the Baltic countries, Poland, and other countries. But I think now, unfortunately, what Putin has produced is a strengthening of NATO, and much more of a reason for its not only continued existence, but it's building up. I mean, we see Germany for the first time since World War II, greatly all of a sudden increasing its defense spending and making other moves. So, I don't know exactly how this is going to end, except that NATO will be emboldened and strengthened. And that's ironically, that's something that President Putin doesn't want.
Peter, your thoughts on either the U.S. next steps or NATO?
Well, I think NATO's better off for the fact that President Trump raised the issue, not of whether or not we needed NATO, but why the United States was engaged in such dramatic subsidies of NATO, while the European countries were not paying the amounts that they were by treaty obligated to pay as their share of NATO's defense. So the European countries had to take a hard look at their NATO membership. Some of them raised the money they were paying to the amounts that they were supposed to or are unscheduled to. I think it's 2% of GDP. And so I think NATO is actually in a better position. Now that, the Russian bear is awake, NATO's a little bit stronger than it was before Trump came into office. But as for next steps for the United States, I think there are 3, perhaps 4 things that we can be doing. The first thing is that we should be using our technology to ensure that Putin cannot cut off Russian civilian access to global news sites on the internet. There are already demonstrations in Moscow, St. Petersburg, other cities, Russian people coming out against the war. The demographics, the population demographics in Russia are bad. For far too many Russians, they have one son, and that son is in the army, and that son is now at risk. And if we continue the flow of information, we continue the possibility that the people will be involved in the conversation about whether or not to remain in Ukraine or withdraw. The second thing that we need to do is completely, not partially, but completely remove Russia and its access to the international banking system. We have to choke off the money. The next thing that we need to do is be sending Javelin anti-tank weapons and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to the Baltic republics, because they are the likely next target. If we had it to do over again, I think we would have given more to Ukraine if we knew what was coming. We need to make sure the people in the Baltics have the ability to defend themselves if the Russians come their way. And then lastly, we need in the United States to stop buying oil from Russia. They are our 3rd largest oil supplier. Putin is taking the money he is getting from US purchases of Russian oil at high prices to finance the war. We're helping spill Ukrainian blood for Russian oil. And as the old slogan goes, no blood for oil. So even if it means higher prices at the pump here at home, we need to shut Russia out of the energy market as best we can. That will cripple the economy, it will be bad for the oligarchs, and it will tremendously increase the pressure on Putin to leave.
All right. Thank you, Peter. Also this week, President Biden delivered his first State of the Union address. Here are some highlights from the Washington Post.
Tonight, we meet as Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, but most importantly, as Americans, with the duty to one another, to America, to the American people, to the Constitution, and an unwavering resolve that freedom will always triumph over tyranny. Ukrainian ambassador to the United States is here tonight, sitting with the First Lady. Let each of us, if you're able to stand and send an unmistakable signal to the world of Ukraine. Thank you. Tonight, I say to the Russian oligarchs and the corrupt leaders who bilked billions of dollars off this violent regime, no more. We're joining with European allies to find and seize their yachts, their luxury apartments, their private jets. We're coming for your ill-begotten gains. And tonight, I'm announcing that we will join our allies in closing off American airspace to all Russian flights, further isolating Russia. Unlike the $2 trillion tax cut passed in the previous administration that benefited the top 1% of Americans, the American Rescue Plan helped working people and left no one behind. It worked. We created jobs, lots of jobs. In fact, our economy created over 6.5 million new jobs just last year.
Remso, what do you think President Biden was able to accomplish with his first State of the Union address?
I think if you liked him, you really liked it. And if you didn't like him, you really didn't like him. What I do have to say is one of the funniest parts I remember from last night was when he was booed by both GOP members and several members of AOC's squad. The fact that Biden still can't get some of the more progressive people on his camp 1 year in is saying something, because as it turns out, the whole defund the police thing must not have really gone, over to the White House very well. Otherwise, what I found funny was that he seems to be jumping on a lot of MAGA policies. Didn't see that coming. Oh, we're going to build in America. We're going to have American steel. We're going to have built in America stamped on all these things so we can stop relying on China. Where was that when he was campaigning? I certainly don't remember that. And last I checked, the Trump policies didn't really work when it came to bring stuff back home. It was anti-globalist. It was anti-free market. It seems that we're going in that direction. Let's see whether or not it happens.
James, what was your take? What was the president able to accomplish with his address?
Well, the most important thing he accomplished was, unlike 1 year ago, he actually got some Republican members a couple times, I think most or all Republican members, to stand up and clap. That's thanks to the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That was a gift to President Biden politically. And as Remso said, the Buy in America applause line was bipartisan. Although I would say that presidents and other politicians talking about buying in America was hardly new to President Trump. I think every president has said that. Hasn't happened, but they've said that, and he showed, he also looked better, I think, than he has in a while.
Peter, over to you. Your thoughts on the State of the Union.
Well, I think the president's biggest accomplishment in the State of the Union was getting through it without a major stumble. The polling data shows, I don't agree with this position, but the polling data shows that the American people are questioning his intellectual acuity. They forget that he's in his late 70s, and at that age, naturally, you don't necessarily speak as eloquently or as quickly as you did. You move slower. This has some people concerned. A major stumble in the speech would have added to those concerns and undermined confidence in the president. And so by avoiding that, I think he helped himself. An analysis of the speech shows, interesting, for example, that we did not hear the phrase "build back better" once. Remso is correct that President praised what were essentially Trumpian initiatives to restore manufacturing in America and to address the exporting of the supply chain to China. This is different from the union-led Buy America campaigns of the 70s and 80s. This is not a question of buying products from companies because they're made here. This is an initiative to incentivize companies that have relocated their manufacturing operations in China and other parts of Asia to bring them back at least to North America, if not to the United States itself. That's a Trumpian notion. But at the same time he said that, he talked about stricter environmental regulations, higher corporate taxes, going after corporate fraudsters, basically sending mixed messages to business leaders that he's going to depend on to bring jobs and manufacturing back to the United States. That's not the only time he did that in the speech. And his discussion of the inflation that we are experiencing right now and trying in some sense to write it off still to supply chain issues and to the bigness of certain industrial sectors like big tech, big auto, big meat, big soda. It's just wrong. It's just not in tune with the facts. And so I think that the speech itself is a failure. Fortunately for him, nobody remembers the State of the Union address a month after it's over.
And finally, President Biden nominated federal judge Ketanji Brown Jackson for the United States Supreme Court. Here's the story from CBS News.
For too long, our government, our courts haven't looked like America.
Fulfilling a campaign promise, President Biden made history as he introduced the first Black woman ever nominated to the Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown Jackson.
I do know that one can only come this far by faith. Among my many blessings, and indeed the very first, is the fact that I was born in this great country.
From the beginning, the federal appeals court judge was the frontrunner with stellar academic and legal credentials and a compelling life story. Growing up in Florida, the daughter of educators in a family of law enforcement, she said in her high school yearbook, "I want to eventually have a judicial appointment." Her resume reads like that of a future justice. Graduating with honors from Harvard and Harvard Law, she clerked on the Supreme Court for Justice Stephen Breyer, the man she's nominated to replace.
Let's stay with Peter. What are you going to be looking for during Judge Jackson's nomination process?
Well, first, let me say that I'm very pleased at the way her nomination has largely been received. I am tired of the bickering and battling that occurs every time a Supreme Court nomination opens up. I think that in part is because the legislative branch and the president and the administrative state have abandoned too much of their responsibility and accountability to the courts. And I'm hoping overall that we can reduce the importance of the courts in the federal system. After all, the founders intended it to be the weakest branch, and sometimes now it seems like it's the strongest branch, because they're telling the legislature and the executive what they can and can't do with far too much frequency. As far as Judge Jackson is concerned, I don't know much about her. I'm interested to hear what her judicial philosophy is. I'm interested to hear whether she largely sides with those people who regard the Constitution as a living, breathing, self-amending document that is a guidepost for decision-making, or whether she sides more with people who believe that the Constitution says what it means and means what it says, and that it is limited in its scope. I suspect more the former than the latter, but that's no surprise. Joe Biden won the election. He gets to pick the justice. That's the kind of justice he's going to pick. I'm going to be interested to hear her views on the administrative state. I'm going to be interested to hear her views on such matters as the on whether there's any kind of equality between the U.S. Constitution and documents like the United Nations Universal Convention on Human Rights and the Europe Treaty, where they are relative to her decision-making process, and just sort of the standard view of what kind of a justice is she going to be? What does she think the job of a Supreme Court justice is?
All right, James, what will you be looking for during the process?
Well, I agree overall with Peter's take. However, I think we have to look at the bottom line, which is that in all likelihood, there will be 52, maybe 53 votes to confirm in the Senate. In the old days, that would not have been enough. You had to have 60 votes, but both parties agreed that you had to change that to 50, or else there would never be a new justice on the Supreme Court. And I think it's sad, and the Democrats historically are just as much to blame as the Republicans, both parties. You can go back to Joe Biden when he was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee and the hearings that he oversaw on Judge Bork, the hearings that he oversaw on Clarence Thomas, who I'm no fan of, by the way. I think it's sad that only 2 or 3 members, if the country is lucky, of the Republican Party in the Senate will vote to confirm President Biden's pick. But that's where we're at, and it's better than a couple of President Obama's picks, one of whom famously, Attorney General Garland, didn't even get a Senate Justice Committee hearing, much less a vote in the Senate. So it's slight progress if that's the vote, but I think not where the country should be.
Remso, your perspective?
I'm withholding a majority of my thoughts until she's actually spoken before the Senate. What I can say is, from the brief homework I've done on her, she seems like a person who has done her job well. I mean, everyone has a soft spot for a public defender. She seems like she has the credentials to be a Supreme Court justice, even if I disagree with her ideologically. I just wish that when President Biden was announcing his initial thoughts on who he was going to pick a few months ago, he would have led with, I'm going to pick a person who is qualified to do this, who will do a good job, and not just, I'm going to pick a Black woman. I think that's a disservice to her. But ultimately, if she is, as she brought up in her remarks last week, a person who will be able to stand up for herself despite the president that nominated her, it'll be for history to say the rest.
Now we have some questions from our viewers. And our first question is from Katrina Bryant, who asks, how long can Russia withstand the sanctions placed on it by the international community? Let me open to our panelists and see who would like to take that one first.
I don't know how long they can withstand the sanctions. I hope it's not long. I think they've had plenty of time to prepare for them, which is why in my remarks tonight, I've called for the sanctions to be as tough as they possibly can be. But it's not clear. And there are some nations that may try to help the Russians surreptitiously by buying grain from them, by buying vital minerals from them, by buying energy from them. We're buying energy from them, which we should not be doing. So any real currency that they can get, because nobody in their right mind would consider the ruble real currency. Any real currency they get extends the amount of time the Putin regime can survive and extends the amount of time they can stay in Ukraine. So I'm hoping the sanctions are tough enough to make this short and cause the Russian nomenclatura, to use the communist era word, the top folks in Russia, to make a decision that it's us or Putin. So we're going with us. And Mr. Putin, again, is ushered off the world stage.
Remso or James, would you like to respond as well?
If I can go ahead, I think one of the things that a lot of people are actually starting to wake up to is the fact that when you can go ahead and remove people from the global market by manipulating whether or not they have access to their own money, whether or not they could trade their national currency for another currency, we're starting to see on both sides, through both Ukraine and Russia, what happens to just everyday regular people. I mean, the people of Russia are almost just as victim as the people of Ukraine, because I don't think a lot of them anticipated that this was going to happen, whether they supported it or not. And now what's happening? People are actually trading gold coins at borders to try and escape. That's what we've come to. You have a lot of people online who are going viral right now because they were putting their Bitcoin addresses on Twitter saying, I've been locked out of my bank account. Or if you're Ukrainian, I don't have access to the internet. I have no money, but I have my phone. I have access to the internet, and everyone can take Bitcoin at some point here in Europe. And same goes for Russia. Russia went ahead and banned Bitcoin lightly, but for the most part of a year, that hasn't really been enforced. So now Russians are still able to access the global economy through cryptocurrency. I think the one thing that ultimately people need to understand is that nations go to war. People rarely go to war against each other. And it's the everyday working class people of both nations who are victim to everything that's happening right now. When you can control somebody's money and their access to it, you control their lives.
Our second question comes from Merle Wallace, who asks, Joe Biden was perceived as the moderate alternative to Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary. In reality, has the Biden administration been any more moderate than a Sanders administration would have been?
Absolutely. That's a clear answer. If Joe Biden was Bernie Sanders, the squad, as I think it was Peter pointed out, or maybe it was Remso, I apologize, the squad would not be as upset with him as they are on several key issues, and they would not have either, I don't know, refused to applaud or booed when he said fund the police. He said it about 3 times during his State of the Union speech. Bernie Sanders, I can guarantee you, would not have stood before the joint session of Congress and said, fund the police. He might have said defund the police, I'm not sure, but he certainly would have worked to defund police forces and a lot of other differences. So yeah, Joe Biden is a lot different than Bernie Sanders.
Peter, your take?
I just want to say that I'm thinking that a lot of these labels have lost their meaning over the last 10 or so years. And they get thrown around. I will say this. I think that Mr. Biden is more in sync with the traditional notions of the American economic experience than Mr. Sanders is, but that doesn't make Biden a moderate.
Remso, your perspective?
I often wondered this, and I think I have to agree with James. I mean, as much as we might be afraid of the imperial presidency, as much as we might be afraid of what happens when the other party takes charge, the beautiful thing about America is that we're so damn complicated. It's hard for anyone to really screw up every part of our lives. And I think if, let's say, we had a President Bernie Sanders, if God forbid that ever happened in some bizarro Twilight World scenario, he would have still dealt with Republicans. He would have still dealt with, with governors that didn't want to deal with his stuff, and, the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the Lauren Boeberts of the world. I think he would have had to go ahead and concede, because at the end of the day, the presidency eats its own people alive. Even Obama went gray. It's hard to say what would have happened to Sanders, because we're already seeing it deteriorate at Biden.
Well, now it's time for the most underreported story of the week. Let's stay with Remso. Your story, most underreported of the week.
There was a Sasquatch sighting in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. And I know that in the middle of Ukrainian, refugees fleeing over borders, Putin, people wonder or not whether he's still alive or something, the State of the Union, everything else. I think small stories like that need to remind us that even in the midst of a crazy, crazy world, you still get crazy local stories that remind you that life still moves on, regardless as to what's on the mainstream media.
That's terrific. Peter, over to you to top Remso's story.
Well, I can't top it, but the undercovered story here are the number of factual errors that President Biden made in his State of the Union address. For 4 years, we watched the chattering classes in Washington pick apart every Trump speech and broadcast every mistake as a lie and as a deliberate lie. One example I'll give the comments that the president made attributing to much of the inflation to the rise in the price of new cars. Well, in fact, the rise in the price of new cars has only contributed about 6% of the total inflation. The economy is starting to melt down. The Atlanta Fed is projecting growth for the last quarter to be 0.0. You get 2 of those quarters and you're in a recession. The American Rescue Plan that Biden touted dumped a lot of money into the economy that nobody had the ability to spend. And now we're dealing with inflation like we haven't seen since the 1970s.
Okay. And James, over to you for the most underreported story of the week.
Well, I'm not sure it's the most underreported story of the week, but it's an underreported story that I find fascinating and important. Mr. Zuckerberg and other titans of social media have properly gotten a lot of criticism for failing to police their incredibly influential sites, and for failing to recognize that they are now major, if not the major, news sources for tens of millions of people, not just in the United States, but around the world. And there is a somewhat new initiative that Zuckerberg is very involved in and spending a lot of money on. TikTok is involved with, the other social media sites are involved with, where they are giving very large contracts to outside companies to vet the truth content of the posts on their sites. I'm becoming involved right now with an effort that one company is heading up to vet claims by both the Ukrainian government and the Russian government, the Ukrainian military and the Russian military on Facebook, primarily on Facebook. Facebook's spending a lot of money to do this. I think it took Zuckerberg way too long to get serious about policing his site, but this is a good sign that he's finally doing it.
Well, my friends, that's all the time we have for this week. Thank you to our guests, and thank you to our viewers and listeners of The Square Circle. I'm Eric Miller. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and like this video, or give it a 5-star rating on your podcast platform. We'll see you next week.